I'm Yasmin Zaerpoor, Director of Water Equity and Climate Resilience at PolicyLink. Many of you may know me through our work together with the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus. Woo! We're a national network of frontline organizations and national allies working at the intersection of water, climate, and justice. It's my pleasure today to introduce our panelists in a minute. Before we do, I just want to thank Dig Deep, Vessel, and Water for People for bringing us all together the last few days. Today's programming, starting with this plenary, demonstrates the importance of collaboration between community leaders, organizations, and their government partners to maximize their impact in achieving equitable WASH outcomes. So the numbers that we get from Dig Deep, just to ground us again in the work that we're doing, over 2 million people still lack access to running water and adequate sanitation. Native Americans are 19 times more likely, and Black and Latino communities are 2 times more likely than white Americans to lack these basic necessities. Tens of millions of people live without clean water in their pipes. So as we know, part of this gap is due to underinvestment and disinvestment in water and sanitation infrastructure, and part of it's due to structural barriers that underserved communities face in gaining access to available federal funding. So just to reorient, some of the themes that we've heard over the last few days have included ensuring equitable access to federal funds, the need to rebuild trust between frontline communities and government agencies, and the need to address systemic barriers that maintain the water and sanitation access gap. So today's panel will give everyone insight into what different government agencies are doing to close the water gap in the US, and together what the government and US WASH sector can do to explore actions, solutions, and partnerships for the future. I do have notes here. In the interest of time, I'm just gonna say one sentence about each of our panelists, and then feel free to expand because you all are cool people. I'll start with Andy. So Andy Berke is the administrator of the Rural Utility Service at USDA's Rural Development Mission Area. Welcome, Andy. Yeah, let's welcome them. Wendi Wilkes is the Director of Infrastructure Implementation in EPA's Office of Water. Welcome, Wendi. And Tracy Goodluck is the Senior Advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at the Department of the Interior and is a member of Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and is also Muskogee Creek. Welcome, Tracy. All right, let's get started. So as you all know, there are significant challenges in expanding universal access of WASH services, including lack of federal funding and our barriers to accessing available funding. So in the first round of questions, I'd love to unpack how these investments and programs are geared towards addressing water and wastewater access gaps. Wendi, we'll start with you because you're in the middle. In your capacity at the EPA, you manage roughly $50 billion in bipartisan infrastructure law funding, as well as the water technical assistance programs. Can you talk a little bit about what impact these funds and programs have already had in underserved communities dealing with outdated or a complete lack of water and wastewater infrastructure?
Yes, thank you for the question. And I'll start with a thank you to our sponsors and the organizers of this conference. As was said this morning, often the gap here in the United States is not talked about on the international and domestic stage. So I appreciate all of you in this room for bringing your energy to this issue, because I do think energy is what we need to have to close the gap. So I know you guys have been working tirelessly, and I think we're all gonna ask you to keep working and keep working with us. So thank you for having us here today. Maybe let me set the stage a little bit, right? Because we can get quite abstract, and I feel like my perspective has been blown completely apart when we talk about things like $50 billion for water. What does that mean? Just to put that in context, pre-bipartisan infrastructure law, EPA's water investments were somewhere between $2 to $3 billion a year. So when we look at, this is a significant increase, right? The bill is a 5-year spend, so it's not exactly $10 billion a year, but if you split it that way, right, you're talking about like a 3 to 5 times increase in the money flowing through these programs. So it really is a tremendous moment. We have more money in our system than we've ever had, yet we know it's not enough still, right? The incredible thing about this $50 billion investment is that about 50% of it has to go to communities that are disadvantaged, and it has to go out as forgivable loans or grant funding. So now is the moment, right, to really take advantage of these programs, especially for communities who haven't had access to the funding before, haven't had a seat at the table before. But we know a dollar available is not a dollar in hand, right? Like, you know, sure, we have 50 billion available, but what does that mean to a community that doesn't know how to work the system, doesn't know how to apply for this, has never heard of the program before? And that is where EPA said we have such a big opportunity here, and we started to set up really the largest technical assistance apparatus that EPA has put forward. You know, we know many of you have been working on this issue for decades, but we have a chance with renewed money, renewed energy to kind of keep working and magnify our work. So what EPA has done is set up, we started out with 3 pilot programs in 2022, and one was focused on closing the wastewater access gap. We have many folks here from EPA who are working on these programs here, so thank you guys for being here today, and thank you for your work. It's an honor to work next to you all at EPA. And the Closing the Wastewater Access Gap is in partnership with USDA, and that's been going well, and hopefully we'll touch on that more. We also have our Lead Accelerator program and a community solutions pilot. We've now launched from those pilots 3 national programs, right? So we have our national environmental finance centers, many of which I see represented in this room. We have our Get the Lead Out, which is a nationwide lead pipe replacement program. And then we have our nationwide Closing the Wastewater Access Gap. So we are making real progress. I'll say with our pilot program for Closing the Wastewater Access Gap, that was focused on 11 communities. I think 8 of those 11 communities at this point have received some level of funding. We have 3 communities who have applications into the State Revolving Loan Fund, which is kind of the bread and butter water infrastructure financing and funding program. So we are seeing real progress happening. And I'm excited by the partnerships and the folks in this room, because I think you guys are going to be the ones who help carry us even further.
Thanks, Wendi. I want to thank you personally, too, because I feel like I'm on calls with you all the time. Andy, this question's for you. So for decades, USDA support has been seen as the last line of defense for rural communities. Through the Rural Utility Service Water and Environmental programs, rural communities can access technical assistance and funding to improve drinking water and waste disposal systems. Can you speak to the impact of this work on rural communities across the nation?
Yeah, great. And thanks again to the organizers and to all of you who are out there doing this work every day. I'm really just here to get a loan from Wendi. You know, we need a piece of that $50 billion. Sounds pretty good. I think it's important to set the stage. So I'm the administrator of the Rural Utility Service. We're located within the Department of Agriculture. What we do is make sure that communities in rural America have the infrastructure that they need to succeed, and for families there to grow their income and quality of life. So we have 3 divisions: electric, high-speed internet, and water. And if you think about it, you know, those are essentials that people need to make it in 2024. What I do when I go out every week is see communities all across the country who are in desperate need of this type of infrastructure. And the easiest way to think about this is our water program mostly, almost solely, but mostly affects communities or helps communities that are under 10,000 people. So you don't have to be a math genius to understand that if you are building a system and it is a mile or more between places that are putting money back into the system, and you're having to put pipes and everything else during that mile that's giving you no return whatsoever on that, it's a very expensive system. And so 2 things happen. Number 1 is if people move in, you just might not build any infrastructure out there at all, because why am I going to do that when it costs me so much money for one house or one farm or whatever it is? And the second thing is to maintain that. It's incredibly expensive because you don't have the funding that comes in, and that has effects for the people who live there, because 92% of the counties that we served are the most economically disadvantaged in the U.S., and that means that they have also have the highest infrastructure costs, because there may be, again, only one meter, only one payment per mile or less. And so the funding that we have is essential to ensure that these communities can maintain or build the infrastructure that they need, including water. Last year, we did about $1.7 billion that affected 1.1 million Americans in rural America. And you could see that number, again, if I get that loan from Wendi, to continue to climb, because these are incredibly necessary projects. The last piece I'll just say before I go on, and Wendi touched on this a fair amount, is that we have an immense amount of technical assistance. We have circuit riders that basically help these communities figure out what is needed and how to operate these systems. That's important as well, because if I used to be in local government, okay? It was hard for us, it was a pretty big local government. It was hard for us to maintain the technical capacity that we needed to ensure that we could run our systems. Now you think about a town that may have 1,200 people, and they have a water system. They may only have 1 or 2 employees for that government. And so this technical assistance piece is essential for ensuring that these systems can operate.
Thank you, Andy. Technical assistance comes up a lot, obviously. So it's great that both departments are providing more of it. Tracy, you're a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and have spoken before about disparities in resources allocated to tribal communities. The bipartisan infrastructure law allocates much needed new funding towards building or repairing water and wastewater infrastructure for tribal communities. How big of a shift is this really? And can you walk us through new opportunities coming along because of this level of funding for tribes and Native American communities?
Sure, thank you for that question. And I want to echo, well, before I start, I need to give a shout out to Emma really quick. I don't know where she's at, but those shoes are fabulous. And I need a pair. So, okay, so please give her that message wherever she's at. And thank you all for being here and having me here today. I really appreciate it. Sikoli, Swagwaits, Tracy, Kennard, Goodluck, Nunyet, Oniot, Agani'i. So I'm a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. I'm also Muskogee Creek, and I'm an in-law to Dene Navajo people in Arizona. My husband comes from Chinle, Arizona. And I kind of want to start out with that because this really centers a lot of the work I do. So previously, in a previous life, I was both an educator, a classroom teacher. For the federal government, I had a former position where I was the deputy director of the Secretary's Indian Water Rights Office at the Department of Interior, so negotiating federal water settlements with tribes and the federal government, cities, municipalities, states, et cetera, to really protect those resources for our tribal nations. But on a personal level, my husband comes from a community called Chinle, Arizona, on the Navajo Reservation. But 9 miles west of Chinle, or west of Chinle, out on the mesa top is actually where he was born and where he was raised by his grandparents up until he went to school, to kindergarten. They had no running water or electricity, so my husband has that lived experience of not having those resources provided to him. He also didn't know growing up that was something that everybody else had. Fast forward to when I met him and I was out there on the reservation with him, I physically helped haul the water. So taking a pickup truck with a large, canister to get water from a well and then take it back up to his grandma's house. I had to help chop wood so that she would have wood for her stove and for lighting. She used kerosene lamps. She used a wood stove. So I've experienced that. And then as a teacher, both on the Navajo and Hopi reservations in Arizona, I have taught students who did not have access to running water or electricity. It's one thing to say you don't have that, but to have them, to teach them, to see them every day and know that they're living without the same kind of equities that you have, you really see that disparity. So this isn't just something that I talk about just to talk about. This is an actual lived experience. I've also been privileged in this position to travel with my boss, the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, Brian Newland, to rural Alaska, to rural remote villages, both off the coast and in interior Alaska, who, you know, we've used the honey pots. And if you haven't had that experience, I encourage you to do so, and then you'll recognize your privilege that we have when you have access to running water and other things. So I've experienced the needs in our tribal communities, and that helps shape the work I do. And so moving on, I want to say, now moving to the bill and the question you asked around the historic funding, and is it a shift? It absolutely is. And I'm going to start at the beginning of the administration when the president rolled out the American Rescue Plan funds, the ARPA funds. There were $32 billion invested in tribal communities, and $30 billion of that went directly to tribes, not to us as the federal government, but pushed out directly to tribes. There's $13 billion in the bipartisan infrastructure law, and then there's another $720 million through the IRA. So these are historic amounts making their way to Indian country through various programs. The bill alone, most of the bill funding for Interior is run through the Bureau of Reclamation. I don't work for Reclamation, but I work in partnership with my colleagues in Reclamation every single day. So $8.3 billion of that bill funding is being run through Reclamation for existing programs and new programs that tribes have access to apply for. Now, most of them are in the forms of grants. That's a whole other layer of challenges for tribal communities. But that funding is out there, and it's a huge shift for our tribal communities, some of which, and then within the BIA, we have over $400 million, and $200 million of that is going to support climate resiliency. And we're funding 11 tribes in the planning phase of relocation, and we're actually funding 3 sites right now to actively engage in relocation, 2 sites in Native Alaska villages. One I've been to, and I've seen that coastal erosion. I actually was in this village that we're working to relocate, and while we were there, we actually saw some of the coast just falling off in chunks before our eyes. So we're working with 2 Alaska villages and a tribe in the Pacific Northwest on their relocation efforts. And so $200 million of that funding is going to those 3 tribes and to 11 tribes that are in the planning phase. This is historic funding. I can't underestimate that. And I don't know if we're going to see that again in this country in my lifetime. I hope so, but it's doubtful. And so we're really trying to take advantage of the opportunity we have now. And Andrew talked about the technical assistance challenges, and I will say that's one thing we've seen with this historic funding funneling its way into Indian country. Nobody was prepared for that amount of funding, including us as the federal government. So it's been a learning lesson for us all to figure out how to work together. And a lot of the ways we're doing that is through what we call the White House Council on Native American Affairs. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later, but that is a way for us to break down silos within the federal government to make sure agencies are talking together and amongst one another on the same issues to see where we can work together to make an impact for tribal communities.
Thanks, Tracy. As you're hearing, we have a lot of funding, historic fundings, and we need a lot more. So for those of you that are meeting members today, I hope that's what your message is to them. Historically, many communities, particularly tribal, rural, and under-resourced ones, have been left behind by a lack of equity and infrastructure investment. And we've seen growing attention in the federal government to address these historical injustices and ensure equitable implementation. I know when I started my position, it was maybe a couple months before the bill was passed, and a lot of the community groups that I worked with were really not impressed with the $43 million through state revolving funds and the other big federal funds that were going to go down to communities, because they thought federal programs have never benefited us in the past and they're not going to. And I know all 3 departments have done a lot since then to try to make sure that that money actually does reach the communities that need it the most. As we know, federal programs have not always been beneficial, and in some cases they've been harmful to communities that need federal funding the most. So what are some conversations that you've been having in recent years about equity within the department? And I know you touched on it a little bit before, but what are some ways that you're trying to ensure equity and trying to build trust with frontline communities in recent years? And I'll open it to whoever's ready.
I'll start. Okay, building trust, but before I start, I failed to mention something that's really huge, and if you're going up to the hill today, here's one thing I want to plant. $2.5 billion of the bill funding for Indian Affairs was specific to Indian water rights settlements, which was amazing. It's funding our already enacted settlements, but in our budget requests now, we are requesting for $2.5 billion more in mandatory funding to continue on the Indian Water Rights Settlement Completion Fund, because we already have that amount of settlements pending, teed up to get through Congress to be enacted. So we definitely need more funding there, and we need support for our budget. I just wanted to put that in there. But in terms of building up trust, I mean, that's key. I mean, that's kind of my conundrum as both being a tribal member and also being a federal employee, right? Like, I have this little kind of, my own little, I guess, battle going on in terms of like reconciling the history of the different policy eras of what's happened to our people, but also being a Fed myself. But I'm in a perfect position then to understand that history and push for change and that trust. And one of the ways we do that interior and through the federal government is through our Executive Order 13175. It was actually an executive order from the Clinton administration that's lasted and is pretty much our foundation for everything. And that executive order is our consultation policy. And so it is at Interior, you know, we're led by the first ever Native American woman secretary. Yes, woo. Let's give Secretary Holland a giant woo. I love her. She's an amazing role model, but more importantly, she is the foundation for building that trust right now within the department with our tribes. When you have one of your own leading the department, it's really phenomenal. And the executive order on consultation really needs to drive every decision we make. If there is any kind of tribal outcome coming from a decision we're going to make that's going to impact a tribe, we better make sure we're consulting with tribal leaders and tribal nations and community members on what we're doing. And so that leads and drives all of our work is the consultation EO. Along with that, I think we're building trust right now because the president signed at the last Tribal Nations Summit in November, Executive Order 14112. And if you haven't heard about that, that's a new executive order that is geared at changing the way that we provide federal funding to Indian country. There's three main components to it. One is to really analyze, every federal agency is being directed to analyze the unmet needs in Indian country. So right? Finally, it's about time. What are the unmet needs and unmet obligations that we have to provide to tribes? That's never been done. I can't wait till we hear about it. I can tell you in public safety and justice through our TLOA report, we found out that we need $3 billion more in federal funds to meet the unmet needs. So once all the agencies come together with that obligation, it's going to be probably a really amazing number, and I can't wait to see it and to continue talking about that. So that's one aspect of that EO. Another aspect is that to take away some of the challenges and barriers for funding access. So for example, on grants, we're looking at how do we take away some of those barriers around matching requirements for tribes. Yes, I agree. So that's one of the number one things we hear from tribes is, hey, yeah, thanks for making this funding available, but we have no way to do a matching fund, so we're not going to apply, and that's a really sad situation to be in. Or technical assistance. Tribes don't have the capacity. They're not, they don't have that capacity within their own. Some of these tribes are small, they're poor, and they don't have that technical assistance capacity. So providing technical assistance, for example. So that's part of the EO. And the other part of the EO, which I'm really excited about, is providing a one-stop shop for all the funding opportunities in the federal government. And so that will ensure that we're providing one place that tribes can go to, that a tribal grant, manager can go to, and they don't have to go over to Commerce, they don't have to go to EPA, they don't have to go to Interior, they go to this one site, and they can look up every opportunity that's available for tribal funding out there. So that EO, I think, is transformative. Tribes have been asking for it for a long time. I think that's part of building up the trust. I think getting out to the communities it helps build up the trust. It's our policy in our department and in Indian Affairs that we have to get out to the communities. We have to talk directly with the people that are being impacted by our decisions. I can give you an example. I went out to Tule River Indian community with Assistant Secretary Newland last year, specifically because they had a water settlement before Congress, and we needed to determine, are we going to support this or not? So we went out to the community. They hosted us. They showed us their headwaters of the Tule River. But more importantly, they showed us the spot in the river every June and July that it goes dry, that they have no water. They depend on IHS and DOI to hopefully give them water in the summertime so that they can drink water, so that they can take showers, so that their kids have nutrition to go to school. So that I can tell you, when you're there in the community, seeing things firsthand, and you're on their land and you're talking with them firsthand, that makes the difference. We came back from that trip, and I cannot tell you, that changed the way we advocated for that water settlement, and we're able to support it. So I guess those are just a few ways in which we're at Interior making sure we're building up the trust with our tribal nations.
Oh, excellent. Should we just go down the line? Great. Well, I mean, incredible work going on at DOI. I think each of us have kind of a way we're getting at this long-standing issue across our country. Within the Office of Water, when I think about equity and environmental justice, right, it's access to water and access to affordable, consistent, safe water and sanitation services. It is about human dignity, right? I don't think we are ever, we're kidding ourselves if we think we can reach sustainable communities, racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice without that as a basic foundation, right? You can't reach any of those. You cannot reach equity without having first secured water and sanitation for communities. So with that in mind, the ethos of our technical assistance work within the Office of Water is really to, one, show up. And I think many of you guys in the audience probably know how important that first step is, right, is showing up. And I think probably many of you have stories about showing up to a community, and it's the first time maybe someone who's representing the federal or state government has been there, to work next to the partners in the community to make a more sustainable future, access to water services a reality. And so that alone, I think, is a massive step forward. But we're building off of showing up, rolling up our sleeves, right, listening, which is a maybe undervalued skill, but one I think we're all increasingly understanding to be one of the most important. Listening to the community, and then being with them every step of the way in building access to this historic funding. So that's what we're doing with our water technical assistance. I'll also say that this EPA is committed to environmental justice. Many of you might have seen we have done a reorg and created the first ever EPA Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. It's a massive step in having dedicated people, dedicated funds to address environmental justice issues, long-standing issues in our country. So that's great. We have a lot of technical assistance going out through that office as well. And I'll say, rarely in a community do environmental justice or racial issues start and end with water, right? And so I think good government means being able to say, we can help you with this piece, but we know someone else who can help you with this other stuff, right? And that is how you can start to build trust in communities that have really been left out of the conversation for so long. So that's the work that we're doing at EPA. And we didn't get here overnight, right? This is decades of injustices that have been built up, decades of lack of investment or disinvestment. And I hope it doesn't take decades to get out of it. We're working to make sure it doesn't, but the progress isn't overnight. And I know, so many of our TA providers know it takes dedicated and sustained investment and funding and people, right, hand in hand with these communities. And so, to give a plug, as you go out onto the Hill today and you're thinking about how you're having these conversations, that's one of the biggest things I think moving forward that government could use help with is ensuring that our work that we have started or enhanced these last few years continues, because the worst thing that could happen when it comes to trust is that we disappear in the middle of the project, right? Talk about, breaking the trust. So I think we all want to make sure that we're able to continue to be providing this level of service to the people who deserve it.
So a few minutes ago, Tracy called herself a Fed. I kind of, bristled a little bit at the term. Any time that I go into a place, I always say, "Hey, listen, I'm not from Washington D.C. I'm from Tennessee. That's where I'm from." I had some reticence about joining the federal government before I came up here, and one of the reasons why it's been a real pleasure to do so is because from President Biden on down, the focus on equity is there. It's there across everything that we do, and I'm proud to be part of an administration. And you just heard two people who this is at their core, and certainly the work that they're performing inside their departments is at the core. And that, just everything else aside, that's important to me. I think it's important to the administration. That means that more of this gets baked into everything that you do. And so I would just say a couple of quick things. Number one is, I'm really proud of some of the stuff that we're doing about decentralized water and decentralized water systems, including working with EPA. But 1 out of 5 Americans, has some kind of septic system. This is in 2024. We're talking about this case. And so when you see that, you know that there are injustice issues going on there. And so the fact that we're addressing that we've had a focus on that, that's great, again, including in partnership with EPA. But the thing that I really want to focus on, it's the least sexy piece of this, is operationalizing it. So one of the great things about USDA is that we are literally everywhere, right? I mean, USDA is a massive agency. You don't think of it that way, but we are kind of everywhere in all kinds of different ways, and having federal employees. And so we have relationships that go back decades with different communities, and being able to go to, no matter what state it is, to have these conversations to make sure that not only are people who sit in an office in Washington, D.C. talking about something like this, but to know that our employees in Tennessee, where I'm from, Alabama, Arizona, New Mexico, and all across the country are also talking about this and trying to figure it out, and that at a local level, to see the priorities that we're placing there become part of the conversation all around the country, that is really satisfying for me. And I think that has long-term effects long after the administration has come and gone.
Thank you all. Having worked with different communities too, I know how important it is to see government partners in community. We had some advocates from Cancer Alley who talked about how important it was to have Administrator Regan join and the laws that came out of the meetings. All right, so the third question is, many people here are from impacted communities that your agencies work with or hope to work with soon. So I want to transition into discussing how the government and the WASH sector can work together. Tracy, tribes and Native American communities have fought for water rights, access, and equity, and recently had some historic wins, as you mentioned, particularly advocacy around IHH's sanitation facilities deficiencies list, for example. What are ways that the Department of Interior is working hand in hand with tribal nations and Native Americans to elevate Indigenous and local knowledge to ensure that projects are appropriately designed for tribal communities?
Thank you for that question. So as I mentioned before, first and foremost, we have our tribal consultation policy, and that needs to drive every kind of movement within Indian country and our tribal leaders. We have a government-to-government trust responsibility with our 574 federally recognized tribes, we have to hold that consultation policy as, that's our mandate. We have to do that. And so we have to make sure we're in these nation-to-nation dialogues with our tribal leaders on a daily basis. Beyond that, I think some of the things we're doing to make sure that tribes' voices are heard and are at the table and that indigenous knowledge is recognized and a part of the projects moving forward. Again, I'm going to mention the White House Council on Native American Affairs. It was stood up in the Obama administration. It was re-stood up in this administration at the very beginning. And it's really a way in which to, like I said, to break down silos. All federal agencies participate in the White House Council. I work with USDA and EPA colleagues all the time on the issues, amongst others, IHS all the time as well. And so that's one way that we're like kind of memorializing, institutionalizing, whatever word you want to use, but making sure that that work will long outlive any of us up on the stage as feds, that this work will continue on as through the White House Council. But we've done some unique things through the White House Council across the government to make sure that we are creating policies that are going to really recognize tribal indigenous knowledge. One of those is CEQ at the White House put out guidelines and an implementation memo to the agencies specific to indigenous knowledge. And so we took that at Interior and we have put that into our department manual ourselves. So we now have an indigenous knowledge chapter, and that has to inform all our decisions when we're working with tribal nations, that we respect and recognize indigenous knowledge as part of our scientific research and as something that we have to consider when we are implementing and developing and building projects with tribes or anything we're doing. We also have co-stewardship agreements, so a secretarial joint order with Commerce and DOI to recognize and support co-stewardship agreements. And as of last year, we had over 22 of those signed with tribal nations between Commerce, DOI, and tribes, and recognizing that tribes know, that just inherently through indigenous knowledge that how to the best practices on how to work with lands and then their waters. And so that's another thing we're doing. And we also have a sacred sites memorandum that says that sacred sites with tribes, both Alaska Natives, tribes, and Native Hawaiian people have to be respected and taken into account. So those are some ways that we are memorializing that work in the federal government, specifically at DOI, but really working through the lens of the White House Council on Native American Affairs. I forgot what else I was going to say. It'll come to me, so I'll just pass it along. Thank you.
We'll come back to you if you want. Wendi, the EPA is making an active effort to engage community partners through ongoing and new water technical assistance programs, as you mentioned, as well as successful community-level engagement through the Closing the Wastewater Access Gap pilot. How can local leaders, communities, and organizations work together with the EPA Office of Water to close access gaps? In your opinion, are there any particular gaps in awareness that non-government partners can help fill?
Yeah, it's a great question. Two things. First, we are actively looking for communities to partner with through our technical assistance. So if you guys know of any communities, if you are aware of groups who have connections to communities who are looking for support to get their water projects funded, to understand their water challenges that their community might be facing, all you have to do is go to epa.gov/waterTA. I feel like a commercial up here, but we have a lot of capacity to continue to bring on and onboard communities in these programs, and we will continue to have that capacity over the next few years at least. So I really encourage you guys, if you're not familiar with the water TA work that we're doing, please come find me afterwards, and would love to get you all connected. The second thing I'll say is that the best of government investment, when we do it right, it begets additional investment, right? And all other investment wants to build off public investment. So if we, through our technical assistance, our investment of time, our investment of money, if we can build a foundation for a community to be able to accept additional investments, additional support, that is true success, right? And that is putting a community on a virtuous cycle. And that's what we want for a lot of these communities, whether they're rural, whether they're tribal, whether they are large cities who are struggling with population loss or changing weather patterns, right? Like across the country, anywhere where we are investing our public funds, we want that to be a spurious action for additional investment. So whether that is private investment, whether that is foundations, and whether it's investment of time or money, if we're able to partner with you, the dollar goes further. And so even though we're in an era of abundance with money, as we said, as we started this panel with, it's also not enough. So we want to make sure we're judiciously using that money and ensuring that we're taking it as far as we can.
Thank you, Wendi. Andy, the USDA has long been a trusted partner in rural communities nationwide, especially your rural development team. Can you walk us through a couple examples of successful partnerships with NGOs, the private sector, and research institutions in rural America, and how these partnerships have led to increased access to water and sanitation?
Yeah, so this is just, as you said, this is just part of what we do. This is essential, our essential work. And you know, just for a minute, I want to focus. So we have funding, as you said, for partnerships. We have a revolving fund now that we can lend out to nonprofits to help local governments and private entities with their water infrastructure. But I'd just like to give you a couple of examples of like, what does all this work actually mean at the local level? Like, how does this affect people? So you heard Dr. J talking about Lowndes County, Alabama, and this is our funding at work, right? There's this huge environmental catastrophe that you see down there that we're focused on. We're able to put in some funding and make sure that they can build out some sewer capacities to help a community where you see incredibly bad health outcomes from their water pieces. I was in Arizona maybe sometime within the last year to look at a project where we were helping to fund and make sure that they had seen high levels of arsenic. So we're removing the arsenic from the system. On top of that, and I think it was Tracy was talking about, I was looking at areas in there where they were hauling water, which is something that is outside of my lived experience, but able to look at it. And in Arizona, this same system, we needed to build this infrastructure to 237 new homes in the subdivision, a new subdivision, because in Arizona, you're seeing all that housing being built, and you've got water table issues, you've got infrastructure issues. This is what we see every day, and so I think that, kind of making sure that we understand what this looks like on a practical level, watching somebody haul water, understanding what it means to buy. I mean, when I was in Arizona, I just kept thinking about this. Why would I buy a house in a place where I knew I had to haul water? And what are the implications of that for me, for the community? It took me a few minutes to just be thinking through what are all the different pieces of that. And so I think that when you kind of put it in those specifics, you kind of understand what we're dealing with at a national level and why this funding is so important.
Thank you, Andy. Y'all, I thought we had like 15 more minutes, and I just got a note that we're over time. So this is the lightning round. I had all these closing notes that I was going to say it was going to be 15 more minutes of closing notes. This is the first time we've convened as communities and organizations with one domestic wash sector. What are you most excited to see us accomplish together in the near future? And you all got like 30 seconds each.
I'll be really quick, and it's what I forgot to mention earlier, but I'm really most excited about our new Office of Strategic Partnerships within Indian Affairs at Department of Interior. I want to give a shout out to Rachel Brown here in the office, who's worked with me to stand that up in our office. But that is, we are now looking at, we're partnering with philanthropic organizations, foundations, public-private partnerships with the federal government now specific to Indian Affairs. That's what I'm most excited about, because that's how we're all going to partner together and be able to invest more in Indian country. So thank you.
God, there's a lot to be excited about. I'll say that. I'm maybe most excited to see, we're doing a ton of seed planting right now through our technical assistance work, through the infrastructure investments. So I'm really excited to see this multiplied and grown over time, and see the impact of the work. Tracy shared kind of her personal connection to this. I'll say I did not grow up in a house that's counted in that 2.2 million people without access to water and sanitation, but I grew up in a house with a broken septic tank. And I didn't really even realize it until I started working in this space, what that was, right? We didn't talk about it in those terms. But what it meant practically was you couldn't play in the backyard, right? If it rained, you should not be in the ditch because God knows what's in there, right? You shouldn't be in the creek when it's high because of the runoff, right? And so I'm really excited to see like the actual changes that are happening in people's lives because of the work we're doing. And I think I could probably speak for all of us, like that is what keeps us going. And I imagine many folks in this room have a personal connection to this work. And so thank you for your continued energy, support, and work on this really important issue.
I'm looking forward to becoming more solutions-oriented and less program-oriented. And so Wendi mentioned this earlier, where the question that we walk into a community with is not we have this program, what would you like from this program, but we know you have these problems, how can we help solve these problems? I think as we continue to move towards that type of model, we'll be in a better place, and so will the communities we serve.
Thank you. All right, a big thank you to our panelists, and then I think we're out for break. No, come here.
Huge round of applause.